effect is going to be positive. What we're hoping for is to increase the structural diversity, so through, again, the unique behavior of the bison.
Began trying to fix that, not with a new national park, but rather a huge, privately operated nature reserve.
In 2007, a truck backed up to a fence line on the Dutch coast and released 3 enormous animals onto a patch of ground that almost everyone with a biology degree had already written off. The place was called Kronsvlak, a stretch of dunes squeezed between the cities of Haarlem and Zandvoort, in the most densely populated country in Europe. The animals were European bison, a species whose entire modern existence had been shaped by one forest in Poland. Scientists who studied that forest were confident about one thing. These were woodland creatures, dependent on shelter and on winter feeding by rangers. Put them on an open, wind-scoured coastal dune with no handouts, and they would not make it through a single season. 18 years later, the dunes at Kronsvlak look like a different place. Bare sand patches stretch, where dense scrub used to choke the ground. Rare plants and insects that had not been recorded there in decades have reappeared. And the bison that were supposed to die in their first winter are still there, having produced dozens of calves and sent surplus animals to rewilding projects in other countries. It is the kind of before and after story that sounds manufactured for a nature documentary. The unusual part is that almost none of it is anecdotal. There is a published, peer-reviewed vegetation study, herd records going back to the release date, tracking data from GPS collars, and a drinking water utility that can explain exactly why it cares about the outcome. This is a case where the evidence trail is long enough to actually check the claim rather than just admire it. So, let's do that properly. 3 questions need answering in order. What was actually wrong with these dunes before the bison showed up? Why did anyone think bison, of all animals, were the fix? And what changed afterward that can be measured rather than just described? To understand why Kronsvlak was considered a lost cause, you have to understand what a gray dune is, because it's not a term most people encounter outside conservation science. Behind the bright, shifting foredunes that face the sea, there's an older, more settled zone of dune. Instead of loose sand or tall grass, it's covered in a low mat of lichen and moss that gives the ground a soft, silvery green color, hence the name. Gray dunes are strange in that their value comes from instability. They need poor, nutrient-starved sand and patches of open, disturbed ground, because that's the only environment where their specialist residents, rare orchids, ground-nesting solitary wasps, sand lizards, pioneer wildflowers, can survive. It's one of the reasons gray dunes are formally protected across the European Union as a priority habitat. They support species found almost nowhere else, and they are also unusually easy to accidentally destroy through neglect. That is exactly what had been happening at Kronsvlak for roughly 2 decades before 2007. 2 separate pressures were pushing the habitat in the same direction, and both were slow enough that nobody noticed until the damage was already substantial. The first was nitrogen. Decades of intensive agriculture and vehicle traffic across the Netherlands had been quietly depositing airborne nitrogen onto the dunes, season after season. Nitrogen is, in essence, free fertilizer, and a gray dune is a habitat that is specifically adapted to the absence of fertilizer. Feed nutrients into that kind of poor sandy soil, and grass responds by growing thick and fast, smothering the lichen carpet and closing over the bare ground the specialist species depend on. In effect, an ecosystem built around scarcity was slowly being enriched into a condition it could not tolerate. The second pressure came from an unlikely source: rabbits, or rather, the disappearance of rabbits. For centuries, wild rabbits had functioned as the dune system's unpaid groundskeepers. Their constant grazing kept grass cropped short, and their digging kept patches of sand exposed. Then disease arrived. Myxomatosis swept through European rabbit populations in the 1950s, and rabbit hemorrhagic disease hit again in the 1980s, with a further wave around 2015. By the late 1990s, rabbit numbers across the Dutch dunes had collapsed by more than 90%. The animal that had been doing the disturbance work for free, at no cost to anyone, was simply gone. With nitrogen accelerating plant growth and rabbits no longer suppressing it, the outcome was close to inevitable. Woody shrubs and invasive trees, see buckthorn, and an aggressive invasive cherry species, moved in and began closing the canopy over ground that used to be open. Conservation crews spent roughly 20 years cutting that invasive cherry back by hand, and it kept returning. The bare sand where sand lizards laid their eggs, where solitary wasps dug their nest burrows, where certain small flowering plants could only germinate on exposed ground, was steadily vanishing under a thickening green blanket. This is the part that runs against most people's intuition. We tend to associate more vegetation with a healthier landscape. A green, overgrown dune looks more alive than a sparse, sandy one. For a gray dune, that instinct is backward. The habitat's entire value comes from staying unfinished, shifting sand, exposed patches, a mosaic of microhabitats that never fully settles down. The species that live there evolved around constant disturbance, not in spite of it. When the disturbance stops, the ground stabilizes, ordinary generalist plants take over, and the specialists that make the habitat unique simply disappear, outcompeted by species that could grow almost anywhere. What was happening at Kronsvlak wasn't destruction in any dramatic sense. It was a slow slide toward becoming an unremarkable landscape, indistinguishable from countless other overgrown patches of ground across Europe.
Because the decline unfolded over years rather than weeks, it was hard to fight through conventional means. The organization that owned most of this land and watched it happening wasn't a wildlife charity. It was a drinking water company. PWN, the provincial water utility for North Holland, holds around 7,300 hectares of these dunes, and by the time the nitrogen and rabbit problems had compounded, PWN was already trying to manage the decline. They introduced conic horses and highland cattle to graze parts of a reserve on the reasonable assumption that large herbivores browsing the vegetation would hold the tide back. It helped, but not enough. The horses graze grass down, and the cattle browse saplings, and the rate of scrub encroachment slowed in places. But neither species disturbed the actual soil in any meaningful way. They trimmed the vegetation from above without ever breaking the surface, exposing fresh sand, or physically reworking the ground. They were treating the symptom, the overgrowth, without restoring the underlying condition the habitat actually needed, which was open, broken, dynamic soil. The decline continued, just more slowly. Something else was missing, and one person working on the reserve had a theory about what it was. Yvonne Kemp was a project coordinator working with the conservation group Arc Nature alongside PWN, and for years she had been making an argument that most of her colleagues in the bison research world regarded as fringe, if not simply wrong. She believed the standard scientific description of the European bison, a forest specialist, dependent on woodland cover, was based on an incomplete picture and possibly on the wrong picture entirely. The conventional view wasn't unreasonable. It came from direct, sustained observation. Nearly everything known about wild European bison behavior came from the Białowieża forest, straddling the Polish and Belarusian border, the one place on the continent where the species survived, in small numbers, through the centuries when it was hunted to extinction everywhere else. There, bison live under dense tree cover, shelter from weather in the woods, and are fed hay by rangers through the hardest months of winter. Watching that population, the conclusion that bison are forest animals seems obvious. Kemp's argument was that this reasoning gets cause and effect backward. She proposed, and she was not alone among rewilding researchers in this, though it was far from settled science, that bison did not choose forest habitat because it suited them best. They retreated into it because it was the only place left where centuries of human hunting couldn't reach them efficiently. The deep forest wasn't their preferred home, it was their last refuge. By the time anyone began studying European bison systematically, the only surviving population was the one that had been driven into hiding, and that population's habits might reveal more about where humans allowed bison to survive than about where the species actually thrives. Under this reading, bison historically ranged across open and semi-open terrain throughout the continent, grasslands, river floodplains, coastal margins, long before hunting pressure boxed them into the forest. It's worth being precise about what's established fact here, and what's interpretation. That today's wild bison live almost exclusively in forest is a fact. That this makes them a forest-adapted species by nature is an inference, and a genuinely contested one among ecologists. Kemp's version of bison history is a hypothesis, not a proven conclusion, and researchers in the field still disagree about how far it should be taken. What Kronsvlak offered almost by accident was a rare chance to test a piece of that hypothesis directly under controlled and observable conditions. If bison really were biologically restricted to forest environments, a herd placed on an open coastal dune should struggle and behave like a forest population stripped of its usual support. If Kemp's reading was closer to the truth, the same animals might do something quite different. There was really only one way to find out. The way the project was structured says a lot about how seriously the organizers weighed the risk, though the caution seems to have been directed less at protecting the bison and more at managing the fallout if the experiment went wrong in public. The Netherlands has no remote wilderness where a failed rewilding attempt could quietly fade from view. Kronvlak sits roughly 5 kilometers from the center of Haarlem, hemmed in by roads, residential neighborhoods, and a steady stream of visitors. If bison starved there, it would not happen quietly. It would happen in view of a country with almost nowhere to hide a mistake. There was also a wider stake riding on it. Across Europe, a slow patchwork effort was underway to reintroduce large grazing animals to landscapes that had lost them generations earlier, and each of those projects existed on politically thin ice. A high-profile species like the European bison visibly failing on a Dutch coastline, apparently because researchers had ignored established warnings, could have damaged public confidence in rewilding efforts well beyond this one reserve. Starting small was a way of containing that risk. So the team moved cautiously. They sourced animals from the Biologists population, the same source population the conventional forest specialist view was built on, which meant any different outcome couldn't be dismissed as simply using a different, more adaptable subspecies. They fenced an initial 220 hectares. On April 24, 2007, 3 bison, 1 bull and 2 cows, were released onto the dune. It was the first time wild bison had set foot on Dutch soil since the Roman era. 11 months later, in March 2008, 3 more animals arrived from the same forest, bringing the herd to 6. The most consequential decision the team made was what they chose not to do. They provided no supplementary winter feed. If the animals genuinely needed the kind of support rangers gave them in Biologists, the lack of hay would expose that quickly and unambiguously. If they didn't need it, the bison would have to demonstrate that themselves, without any safety net built into the experiment. Releasing 3 animals first and waiting nearly a year before adding 3 more wasn't timidity so much as basic experimental discipline. It gave the team time to observe how the initial group handled the terrain before committing a full herd, and it kept the project small enough to reverse quickly if something went badly wrong. A problem with 3 animals is containable. A problem with a full herd in a country this densely populated would have been much harder to manage and considerably more damaging to public trust in the idea generally. It's also worth being clear about what this project was not. It was not a release of animals into open, unfenced countryside. That would have been politically impossible in the Netherlands. The bison remained inside a monitored, fenced reserve throughout, with the enclosed area only expanded once results justified it, which matters for evaluating the outcome, because it means what happened next was observed under controlled conditions rather than guessed at from an uncontrolled one. The first winter came in off the North Sea, cold and exposed, and it produced the first real result. The bison did not need supplementary feeding. Field records describe them digging down for roots, stripping bark from creeping willow and young oak trees, and rolling in the sand, feeding themselves entirely on what the open dune had to offer. All 6 animals survived. The second winter followed the same pattern, again with no additional feed provided. This is the point where the claim moves from theory into documented fact. According to the project's own records, this was the first known instance of a European bison population surviving an open coastal landscape without supplementary feeding. That's a specific, verifiable outcome, and it directly contradicted the standing prediction that these animals simply could not manage in that kind of terrain. A species the scientific literature had filed firmly under deep forest, had just spent 2 North Sea winters sustaining itself on a bare Dutch dune. Reaction from parts of the established bison research community was, by Kemp's own account, dismissive, summed up in a phrase she has since recounted: "Bison on dunes, the crazy Dutch." Given how entrenched the forest specialist view was, the skepticism is understandable. But the survival outcome held regardless of what anyone expected. And survival, while significant, was really only the opening finding. What turned out to matter far more was what the bison's presence was doing to the ground itself. The most thoroughly documented mechanism starts with sheer size. A European bison weighs somewhere between roughly 600 and 900 kilograms, making it around 5 times heavier than any other grazing animal present on the dunes. That mass lets it reshape the ground in ways lighter animals physically cannot. Several times a day through the warmer months, a bison drops to the ground and rolls, a behavior called wallowing. It cleans the coat, dislodges parasites, and helps regulate body temperature. Every bison does it regardless of habitat. But when an animal that heavy rolls repeatedly in the same spot, it scrapes out a shallow depression of loose, bare sand roughly 2 meters across. Each wallow is a small, fresh opening in otherwise closing vegetation. Researchers from University of Groningen, Utrecht University, and partner institutions mapped and counted these features over the project's first 8 years, and found the herd wallowing frequently enough to produce thousands of these bare patches across the bison's range. That matters enormously because bare, disturbed ground was precisely what the dune ecosystem had been losing. The bison were generating it continuously as an incidental byproduct of completely ordinary behavior. And the species that depend on that kind of ground responded. Sand lizards began laying eggs in the warm, loose soil of the wallows. Solitary sand wasps dug nest burrows along their edges. The seaside pansy, a small flower that can only germinate on bare ground, started appearing in areas where it hadn't been recorded in decades. It's fair to describe these as observed patterns consistent with the mechanism, rather than proof that the bison alone caused every individual recovery. Dune ecosystems are complicated and multiple factors interact. But the pattern lines up cleanly with what the underlying theory predicted, and this is also where the evidence is strongest, because the behavior, the resulting wallows, and the species using them were all directly observed rather than inferred after the fact. The bison affected woody vegetation too, and here the mechanism is just as concrete. The same invasive plants that crews had spent 2 decades cutting back by hand, creeping willow, hawthorn, the invasive cherry species, became food and scratching posts for the herd. Bison strip long vertical bands of bark off tree trunks. When bark is removed all the way around a trunk, the tree dies, a process foresters call ring barking, because it cuts off the tissue layer that moves nutrients between roots and canopy. In effect, the bison were killing some of the exact same invasive trees the conservation crews had been targeting, just through a different process. And the outcome was different too. Ring bark trees don't get carted away like felled trees from a chainsaw crew. They die standing. Standing deadwood isn't waste in ecological terms. It becomes habitat for deadwood-dependent beetles and the whole web of species that rely on decaying timber, a resource category that gets removed entirely when a clearance crew hauls cut wood off-site. As the dead trunks lost their foliage and the surrounding scrub thinned out, more light reached the ground, benefiting exactly the low pioneer plants that gray dunes need to survive.